This is David Rodecker, and I'm going to be talking about database janitorial, cleaning up the old relevant ads database stuff. This guide can be found at url.localsplash.com/dbcleanup. The reason I created this is I wanted to create a basic understanding of the ways of going back and cleaning up the database and a few different tactics and how to do so. And why we do this is over time we've had a lot of database objects created and many of those are no longer used. I believe that there's probably about 30% of our database objects could be removed safely and or at least can be removed with some effort safely, and this process will we'll identify the process how to go through and figure those out. This is important because in doing this we allow for the database to be freed up from a lot of the contentious things that do get still processed. A lot of these things that even though they're no longer used, the database may still process and chew on doing activities for these things. So you'll see that there's jobs and error checks and reports that are still run even though nobody uses them. By getting rid of these things, we'll free up resources and prevent blocks from happening that may block normal user activity. So we'll get overall faster performance. And secondly is the database will get smaller, and a smaller database means that it can be much more efficient and faster for backup and recovery. And lastly, it's just nicer to look at a database and code that is relevant and useful and is free from things that are no longer useful and needed. So just nicer for long-term, more sustainable to look at. So how do we go about this? I've referred to what is an unused object as a candidate unused item, and it's candidate because we don't know. So we start with a question: can this object be deleted? And at a high level, well, we should probably question that on every object in the database as a cursory audit. So that could be quite exhaustive since there's over 1,000 objects. But once we have a candidate object, we then go and look to see where it's being used within the database. So we identify all the database objects that depend upon the candidate. This is kind of self-referential and different activities of things that other store procedures, other views, other functions that might depend upon it. And then with all of the list of all the dependencies, we look to see where those are used in source code. And lastly, if we find that it's not in use, we validated that and or it shouldn't be in use, and we will then take steps to remove it from source code if it's still there and it can be removed, and all the way up to the database objects. So a little bit more in depth, and then I'll go through a specific example. So identifying an unused database object, I've also linked a spreadsheet here where we can keep track of that. So how do we identify something that isn't used? I've said that it might stick out. So how does it stick out? Well, if there's a section of our manager or a database object that doesn't look to be in place, well, and then maybe it's a good candidate. So that's a hard thing to look for, but if we look through reports and cache views, error checks, and different places, and we see things that are disabled, that might be a good place to start. There also may be pages that have areas that are completely disabled or not displayed, and those hidden objects or hidden pages, no longer linked to pages, are going to point to objects that are probably not used. So that's going to be a pretty big list, and one thing that we can do is look through reports to see things that aren't used or rarely used but may be consuming a lot of time and resources, jobs that take in a considerable amount of time, or reports that are taking a lot of processing time but they show little usage, and those usage reports are available in the system in different places. And also if we cross-reference the server logs, the web server logs, and look at all the pages that are being hit, and let's say we took 1 month of activity, or even a week or a month of activity, and compared it to all the known pages on the website and which pages aren't used. That would tell us a good list of candidate objects then that might be in those pages that are not being used. And if we see Windows services on our servers that are disabled or have been known to be disabled, we should look to see all of the related store procedure objects and can they be removed, and those are good candidates. So I'm going to go ahead and use a particular example of one of our reports, and that is error checks, error check management. This can be found in admin under error checks. And I'm just going to start with the first item here. It says error function macro crawler, and this function error call. These are literally is a dynamic SQL that's written here that when we created error checks that the error check system uses. And I'm noticing this first one here is not enabled. There's an enable checkbox. First three are not actually, so it's not until here. And so this is a case where this particular object, I've gone ahead and did a search in the database and using SQL search. And I see that it's not in use except with itself. And by the way, if I felt this wasn't adequate, SQL search might not be showing me everything, I could reindex. You might also need to refresh SQL search altogether. But if I really wanted to get desperate, I can go here to RAUtil03 backup / RASQL01 and open up this file here for spcode.relevantyellow, which shows me all the source code for relevant yellow database. And if I search here for that store procedure or that function name, indeed it's only used in this for itself. So I've validated this thing is not in use, and I'll go ahead and make use of that knowledge in just a minute, because I know that's not in use anywhere else in the database. Then I'm going to go ahead and go to the next step here, which will top level search. So I'm doing SQL search, and I looked at the database store procedure file if necessary. And I didn't find any dependencies, but if I did, I would go back and let's say I found a third SQL object that depended upon this one. Well, now I have to expand my search and recursively use that object. So fortunately, I didn't need to do that. In my next example, I will. So with that list of objects, I will go see if where they're used in source code. So this is important that I'm looking to see the external dependencies at this point of any of those objects. Now, because this was a function, it is only used internal to SQL Server, and we do not let anything external the only external references we have are for stored procedures. So I don't even really need to go check source code to see the usage in this case. If it is, one other thing I should go check though is, well, if it's used in an error check, and this one is, reports, cached views, or placement trigger SQL statement. So how do I go check all of those? Unfortunately, I have to check each one of these separately. So let's say I want to go see if it's used in reports. Well, the reports are here in RPT. Why is that keep going up? Report SQL like, and I'm going to go ahead and check for this error function iMacroCrawler. So it's not used in reports. And I would do the same thing to check to see if it's used in error check. I got one finger off in my check here. Essentially, I'm just going to validate that it's only used in the one error check. If it was another error check used, then I might pause, go, oh gosh, someone's actually using it. So I'm pretty confident this isn't used anywhere. So I've gone ahead and renamed it, and that's my action. So in continuing here, the steps that I take are to, once it's validated that I don't have any dependencies on it, I'm going to go ahead and skip to removal. So removal is where I'm removing it from source code. I'm then making sure if I did have source code to deploy it to live production, and that may take a sprint cycle. So I may need to wait a week or so. Then after it's been deployed and I had no dependencies on it, I can come back and rename it to Delmy. So in this case, I didn't do that because there was no dependencies in the source code about it. So on my next example, it's going to be a little bit more complex where I do need to go look at code and I do need to remove it from source code. On second thought, that will take a little bit of time to orchestrate that example. And rather than spending 20 minutes on another video, I will make that a team activity. But leave you with a little bit of tease on the fact that in doing that search in source code where the dependencies of a stored procedure, we really need to do an exhaustive search of all the source code, which may include using and searching all the files in a project. So the straightforward way to search a project is Control-Shift-F, and you type in, and let's just say I was searching for the function call of the error check, and I don't think that I will find any functions altogether in oh, there's one. In all of our source code, we have one function that's hard-coded in here. I don't know why that is, but we should never have a function called. This is literally one of our only exceptions. I'm sure that we have a hard-coded SQL statement in our code. So that is very rare, but let's say I didn't trust this enough because this is just this one application. It is relevant yellow manager web. So I recommend using a search my files to search the file system, and this is very effective. You just point it to the source code directory, and presuming you've got all of source code that for the projects, then you can do a search and see all the references of a particular file and object. So I'll go through that example with the team, and happy hunting for janitorial unused database code.